November 2, 1942, the Western Desert, Egypt, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stands in his command vehicle near the coast road. Watching the wreckage of his Afrika Korps burn across 40 miles of sand, he has 60 operational tanks remaining. General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army has more than 600. A signal arrives from the Force headquarters in East Prussia. It is addressed personally to Rommel. It contains a single instruction, repeated twice for emphasis, not one. Step back. What Rommel did in the following 12 hours was not recorded in most accounts of the war. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, a story where the record actually holds up, where the details come from documents and memoirs and you need logs rather than myth, then subscribe to this channel and leave a like before we go further. Costs you nothing and it tells us this work is worth continuing. Rommel was 50 years old in November of 1942. He had been promoted to Field Marshal 4 months earlier, the youngest man to hold that rank in the German army. Following the fall of Tobruk in June, he had spent 18 months in the desert building a reputation that extended beyond Germany. A commander whose name British soldiers used with a mixture of professional respect and genuine apprehension. By late October, his physical condition had deteriorated badly. Low blood pressure, chronic digestive illness, the accumulated cost of relentless campaigning, and he had been in Germany on medical leave when Montgomery launched his offensive at Alamein on October 23. Rommel flew back against his doctor's advice on October 25 to find his replacement, General Georg Stumm, dead of a heart attack, and his army already buckling under the weight of British armor and artillery he could not match. The order that reached him on November 2 came directly from Adolf Hitler, transmitted through the Wehrmacht High Command, but carrying the unmistakable personal language the Führer used when he intended an order to be understood as absolute. It invoked the honor of the Afrika Korps. It stated that victory or death were the only acceptable outcomes. It commanded that not a single meter of ground be surrendered and that every weapon and every man be thrown into the battle regardless of cost. Under the command structure of the Wehrmacht in 1942, an order bearing Hitler's personal signature was not a recommendation field commander could weigh against his own judgment. It was the law of the army, and disobeying it directly was an act that exposed an officer to charges of treason. Elsewhere on the Eastern Front that same autumn, similar stand-fast orders were being obeyed with consequences that Rommel understood with professional clarity. At Stalingrad, the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus had already received instructions from Hitler forbidding any breakout or withdrawal. Instructions Paulus would continue to follow for another 3 months, until his entire army of more than 250,000 men was destroyed or captured. German commanders across multiple theaters had learned by late 1940 that Hitler's stand-fast orders were not negotiable, and officers who questioned them risked relief from command, court-martial. Or worse, Rommel had every reason to expect that defiance here, in front of the entire German officer corps watching the desert campaign, would end his career and possibly his life. Rommel read the order in his command vehicle with his chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Bayerlein, standing beside him. Bayerlein later testified that Rommel went silent for several minutes, staring at the message, before speaking. According to Bayerlein's post-war account and corroborated in Rommel's own papers later edited by Basil Littlehart, Rommel said that the order asked him to sacrifice an army that could still be saved for a line that could not be held, and that he would not do it. He did not announce open defiance. He continued limited counterattacks for several more hours, partly to comply with the letter of the order, partly to slow the British advance enough to organize an orderly withdrawal. By the evening of November 3 he had made his decision. He began pulling his remaining forces westward against Hitler's explicit instruction, in what amounted to a calculated act of disobedience dressed in the language of tactical necessity. The risk Rommel accepted that night was not abstract. Hitler had relieved and humiliated commanders for far smaller deviations, and a field marshal who openly disregarded a personal order from the Führer was gambling his reputation, his rank, and potentially his life on the calculation that victory in retreat would outweigh the insult of disobedience. He was already a man whose fame made him both protected and exposed, too visible to Germany's propaganda machine to be quietly removed, but watched closely by rivals in the OKW and the SS, who resented his independence. This was not an isolated moment of defiance. Months earlier, Rommel had refused to implement Hitler's commando order against captured British special forces in the same desert, destroying the document rather than carrying out its instructions to execute prisoners. He had also consistently refused SS demands to segregate Jewish soldiers among Allied prisoners for different treatment. The stand-fast refusal at El Alamein followed the same pattern had defined his command throughout the North African campaign, a willingness to weigh orders against what he judged operationally sound and humanly defensible, even when those orders came from the highest authority in the Reich. Rommel's own reasoning, preserved in letters to his wife Lucy later published in the Little Heart collection, reflected a soldier's calculation more than a moralist protest. He wrote that an army destroyed in place served no one, that 60 tanks could not hold a line against 600 regardless of the courage behind them, and that the only meaningful service he could still render Germany was preserving the Afrika Korps as a fighting force capable of defending Libya and eventually Tunisia. He did not frame the withdrawal as an act of conscience against Hitler's tyranny. He framed it as the only professionally responsible decision available to a commander who refused to spend his soldiers' lives on a position had already been lost. This distinction mattered. Rommel was, by the testimony of nearly everyone who served close to him, a man who thought in operational terms first, and his resistance to Berlin's worst instincts consistently emerged from that same practical mind, rather than from abstract idealism. The withdrawal that followed saved the core of the Afrika Korps. Roughly 40,000 German and Italian soldiers escaped the immediate destruction that compliance with Hitler's order would have guaranteed. Many of those men would go on to fight in Tunisia for another 6 months, and a substantial number would eventually survive the war entirely, returning to Germany or living out their captivity as prisoners rather than dying in the sand east of El Alamein for a line Hitler had ordered held for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. Hitler's fury when he learned of the retreat was severe. He summoned Rommel to a tense meeting in Germany weeks later, and intelligence officers and SS observers began watching Rommel's conduct more closely from that point forward. This episode did not stand alone. It was part of the arc that would define the final 2 years of Rommel's life, a steady accumulation of moments in which his professional judgment placed him at odds with a regime that demanded total obedience regardless of cost. The same instinct that pulled his army back from El Alamein would resurface in 1944 when he assessed the Atlantic Wall defenses and pressed for strategic changes Berlin resisted, and again in his peripheral but real connections to officers organizing resistance against Hitler in the months before the July 20th assassination attempt. Each act of independent judgment deepened the suspicion already gathering around him in Berlin. That suspicion reached its conclusion on October 14, 1944. Less than 2 years after El Alamein, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen carrying an ultimatum tied to his connections with the resistance conspirators. He could face trial before the brutal People's Court, a sentence that would likely cost his family their safety and his name its honor, or he could take a cyanide capsule and be granted a state funeral with his family left unharmed. He chose the capsule. He was 52 years old. The withdrawal he ordered at El Alamein, the decision that saved 40,000 men against Hitler's direct command, was one entry in a longer record of independent judgment that the regime ultimately could not forgive. The choice Rommel made in the desert at November night carries a weight that outlives the battle itself. It was not heroism in any simple sense, and it should not be remembered as such. It was a professional soldier's refusal to let political theater dictate military reality. made by a man who would pay for that same instinct with his life less than 2 years later. Somewhere in the calculation between obedience and survival, Rommel chose the lives of his soldiers. History remembers the choice. It should also remember what it eventually cost him.